most important aspects in life is protecting the wildlife. The wildlife drives the Earth's biodiversity. Biodiversity is the diversity, or variety, of plants and animals and other living things in a particular area or region. Without biodiversity, there would be nothing on the Earth. One of the important aspects of biodiversity is that each species of vegetation and creature play a particular role of the circle of life. Protecting their food, shelter, oxygen, and soil enrichment will keep the ecosystem thriving. Our society created many different ways of keeping the wildlife and animal populations up to par. Habitat management and population management are necessary to controlling the population of game animals and fish, and take a big part in protecting the habitat they live in. The significance of wildlife to society is a big deal. It's keep everything moving the way it should be. The functioning of the biosphere depends on the interactions among its animals, plants, and microorganisms. The health of nature and wildlife can help humans' life expectancy be higher. Wildlife maintains the balance of nature and the food chain. There can be ways that harming the wildlife can also be beneficial. For example, many wild trees are used for timber and paper, while some plants can be used for medicine. The recreational use for wildlife draws attention to people also. Fishing, hunting, and hiking are popular examples. There are many places to fish. Lots of lakes, ponds, streams, rivers, and even dams. Different places to fish offer different types of fish. A lake would contain more variety of fish than a river or creek, mainly because it is bigger. A bigger body of water can withstand the pressure of different kinds of fish as long. Wildlife is a term that refers to animals that are not normally domesticated. They are a living resource that will die and be replaced by others of their kind. Wildlife plays an important role in balancing the environment and provides stability to different natural processes of nature. It can be found in all ecosystems, desert, rainforests, plains, and other areas. India's wildlife is both rich and varied. It includes all flora and fauna, animals, plants, and macroorganisms. Wildlife is important for its beauty, economic, scientific, and survival value. It helps to maintain the ecological balance of nature and maintains the food chain. It provides useful substances and wild animal products like ivory, leather, honey, tusk, etc. Besides being a country's cultural asset, it also provides aesthetic value to man. We largely depend on wildlife for every elementary requirement in our life, for example, the clothes we wear and the medicines we consume. Wildlife conservation encompasses all human activities and efforts directed to preserve wild animal from extinction. It involves both protection and scientific management of wild species. Wildlife and nature have largely been associated with humans for numerous emotional and social reasons. Wildlife plays an essential role in the ecological and biological processes that are yet again significant to life. The normal functioning of the biosphere depends on endless interaction among animals, plants, and microorganisms. Wildlife has occupied a special place of veneration and preservation in various cultures of the world. Wildlife is all the organisms that live on the surface of the globe. They are diverse and numerous, as each lives in its appropriate environment. And these organisms feed on food suitable for them. They hunt for her own food without the help of humans. As for domestic animals, they are the opposite of wild creatures, as they live in homes and eat food prepared for them by humans. And don't go out of the house unless accompanied by people, including dogs and cats, which are the most popular pets. The location of wild animals. Wild animals live in many places on the surface of the globe. Some of them live in the mountains and highlands, including what lives in thick forests and above trees. There are animals that live in the desert, where where they adapt to heat and lack of water. The seas and oceans have a huge number of living organisms. And we will not forget the fresh rivers, which contain different species from those that live in salt water. And around the cities, we find some wild animals that lived in the same place before humans occupied it. Wild animal species. There are two types of wild animals, some of which are peaceful and do not represent any dangers to humans or other species. These peaceful animals feed on plants only and do not eat any kind of meat. Among the most famous of these animals are rabbits and deer. The other type is predators that feed on the meat of other animals, including the lion, tiger, foxes, and wolves. These species represent a great danger to residential communities and humans. Threats to wildlife. There are several threats to wildlife, including the risk of expulsion from their lands due to the construction of new cities for humans. As the number of people increased, they needed new places to live, which drives them to remove the wildlife of forests and green spaces. This encroachment on land causes the killing of the environment and the extinction of the living creatures that live in it. With time, we see a noticeable decrease in the numbers of birds and reptiles due to cutting down trees. The second danger to wildlife is pollution. When factories are built near rivers and seas, they pour deadly waste into the water. These residues kill huge numbers of marine organisms. The toxic gases from the factories also kill the birds that live near the factories. Over time, the marine creatures and birds begin to decrease until one day they disappear. Poaching is considered one of the most horrific things that cause the eradication of wildlife of all kinds. When humans catch some fish using explosives, they kill huge quantities and sizes, which causes the death of large fish that lay eggs. This reduces the number of fish over time. Hunting rules must be strictly followed, and the species that the laws provide for protection should not be hunted. How do we protect wildlife? In order to protect wildlife, we must prevent the causes that destroy it. Of course, we must cut down trees and go deep into the forests with great care, and it is better to refrain from this violation once and for all. We must maintain the laws of hunting and not violate them so as not to cause the extinction of certain species. We must plant new trees and allocate areas of land to become nature reserves in which we protect threatened species. These wild animals face great danger as they are subjected to overhunting. It may be expelled from the environment in which it has been living for years due to the desire of humans to expand and build. That is why we must alert people to the danger of eliminating these organisms, and that we must preserve them because of the ecological balance that may be disrupted after their extinction, which will lead to the destruction of the entire planet. Wildlife conservation word reminds us of saving the resources which have been provided to us as nature's gift. Wildlife represents the animals that are not domesticated or tamed. They are just wild animals and living in total wilderness. The conservation of such animals and plant species so that they may be out of the danger of extinction is termed wildlife conservation. It is the sole and social responsibility of human beings, on an individual basis. One should try to conserve our renewable resources. They are precious and must be used up in a wise manner. The wildlife creatures and plants add beauty to our nature. Their uniqueness, beautiful voice of some birds and animals makes the surrounding and the habitat pleasing and wonderful. Protection of the species of wildlife from extinction or vanishing by applying suitable methods is termed as wildlife conservation. The wild animals and plants play an important role in the ecosystem they reside. This is the outcome of the way in which man is changing the lifestyle and advancements in way of living. The enormous cutting of trees and forests is leading to the destruction of the habitats of wildlife. The thoughtless deeds of human beings are responsible for the mass extinction of the wildlife species. The act of hunting and poaching is also a punishable offense. No wildlife species must be killed for the enjoyment purpose. The wild animals and plants are playing an important role in maintaining ecological balance. Their importance could not be denied. There are several factors that are a threat to wildlife creatures. The increasing pollution, temperature and climatic changes, overexploitation of resources, irregular hunting and poaching, loss of habitat, etc. are major causes for the deterioration of wildlife. There are many of the government acts and policies formulated and amended in the direction for the conservation of wildlife. The act of protecting the species of wild plants and animals from becoming extinct is termed as wildlife conservation. The same is achieved through the execution of different plans and policies by the human being. The wildlife is an important factor of our ecosystem. Without their existence, the ecological balance will turn to an imbalanced state. As each and every creature has its right to exist and therefore they must be provided with a proper habitat and conditions. But the conditions prevailing are totally different. Man has become so much selfish in his desires that he forgot that other organisms have the same right. The different illegal practices, advancements, needs have led to the creation of a situation which is an alarming one. There are several factors leading to the destruction of wildlife. Habitat loss, the unwanted clearing of forests and agricultural land to make several building projects, roads, dams is leading to major habit loss of different wildlife animals and plants. These activities deprive animals of their home. As a result, either they have to move to some other habitat or becomes extinct. Overexploitation of resources. The resources are meant to use up in a wise manner, but if used in an unnatural way, leads to overexploitation of the same. The overuse will foster the extinction of the species. Hunting and poaching. The act of hunting and poaching is really a miserable one as it involves the trapping and killing up of animals for the enjoyment of obtaining some product. Some of the animal's products are valuable ones, for example, ivory, skin, horn, etc. They are obtained by making the animals captive or hunting and further killing them after obtaining the product. This is leading to increasing mass extinctions. An example is musk deer. Using animals for research purpose, there are many of the animals chosen for testing results in the laboratory of research institutes. Taking them in such a large number of results in the mass extinction of the species. Pollution, the unwanted changes in the state of the environment leads to a result in a polluted one. And so is the air, water, soil pollution. But the alteration in the quality of the air, water, the soil is directly responsible for the reduction in the number of animal and plant species. The marine biodiversity is greatly affected by the contaminated water. The chemicals present in the water ruptures the functional activities of marine biota. The coral reef is greatly affected by the temperature changes and contamination. Wildlife conservation is the phenomenon of protection and management of wildlife facing the danger of extinction. Wildlife is an important feature of our ecology. They are the animals or plants which are the supporting systems of our ecosystem. They are living in wilderness in some forests or jungles. They are helping in maintaining our ecological balance. The inhuman practices are leading wildlife creatures to become endangered or extinct. India is rich in biodiversity, but there are many factors leading to the loss of the same. Factors leading to wildlife destruction. Overexploitation of resources. Habitat loss. Pollution. Habitat fragmentation. Hunting and poaching. Climatic changes. Types of wildlife conservation. In situ conservation. In this type of conservation, species of plants and animals, and their genetic material are protected or conserved within their habitat. The areas are termed as protected areas. They are national parks, sanctuaries, biosphere reserves. Ex situ conservation. This conservation technique involves conservation or protection of the species of plants and animals, and also the genetic material, outside their habitat. This is done in form of gene banks, cryopreservation, tissue culture, captive breeding, and botanical gardens. Importance of wildlife conservation. Ecological balance. Aesthetic and recreational value. Promotes to maintain biodiversity. Types of wildlife conservation. In situ conservation. In this type of conservation, species of plants and animals, and their genetic material are protected or conserved within their habitat. The areas are termed as protected areas. They are national parks, sanctuaries, biosphere reserves. Ex situ conservation. This conservation technique involves conservation or protection of the species of plants and animals, and also the genetic material, outside their habitat. This is done in form of gene banks, cryopreservation, tissue culture, captive breeding, and botanical gardens. Importance of wildlife conservation. Ecological balance. Aesthetic and recreational value. Promotes to maintain biodiversity. Project Elephant. The increased developmental activities like construction of roads, railways, resorts, buildings are leading to the clearing up many forests and grazing spaces, which results in the destruction of the habitat of different wild animals. The same was observed with elephants too. Project Elephant was launched by the Indian government in 1992 to conserve the number of elephants, maintenance of their habitat, reduce human-animal conflicts, as well as reduce hunting and poaching. This project was launched at the central level, but the initiative was taken up by the states. Funds were also provided to different states according to the requirements. 16 states were mainly implementing the act. Crocodile Conservation Project. This project was launched in 1975, at different state levels. The objective of the project was to prevent the habitat destruction of the crocodiles, and thus helping to increase their numbers. The hunting and killing of the crocodiles should be monitored. As a result of this initiative, the numbers have been increased from 100 to 1,000 till 2012. UNDP Sea Turtle Conservation Project. This project, launched by UNDP, aims at properly managing and conserving the reducing numbers of the turtle population. The results of population explosion and urbanization have to lead to an increase in the activities of cutting down forests and turning them into buildings, hotels, or places of human settlements. This results in a reduction of the habitat of different forest-dwelling species. They have to leave those places and search for new habitat, which is not very easy. The search for new habitat, a lot of competition for food, carries many of the species towards the verge of extinction. Wildlife animals and plants are important aspects of nature. A loss at any level may lead to unnatural consequences. They are responsible for the ecological balance and for the sustenance of mankind. The balance must be maintained. Therefore, along with the conservation efforts by the government, it's our social responsibility to individually put our efforts in conservation of the wildlife. applied non-trained creature species. It presently incorporates all plants, parasites, and different organic entities which develop or live wild in a space without being presented by humans. Domesticating wild plant and creature species for human advantage has happened ordinarily all around the planet. It has hugely affected the climate, both positively and negatively. Wildlife can be found in all biological systems. Deserts, forests, rainforests, plains, grasslands, and different regions, including the most developed urban destinations, all have particular types of wildlife. Most researchers concur that wildlife around is impacted by human exercises. A nursery is certainly not a characteristic environment. However, it is loaded with wildlife. Why is wildlife important? Wildlife keeps up with balance in environments. Each living thing is associated. Assuming even only one living being becomes compromised or terminated, it has a cascading type of influence on a whole biological system. It disturbs the well-established pecking order, sending shockwaves through the climate. It's additionally essential to realize that dangers to species seldom occur in separation. The things that undermine, say, bumblebees likewise compromise different pollinators. For environments to flourish, all wildlife should be secured. Diversity implies better environments. While talking about wildlife, you'll regularly hear the expression biodiversity. This alludes to the number of species in an environment. Sound biological systems have a ton of variety. For what reason is this significant? Think about plants. A wide assortment of plants implies more prominent efficiency and better well-being. Assuming there are fewer plant species, an infection that influences them spreads quicker and all the more viably. More assortment implies better obstruction. Wildlife gives nutrients to people. All that we eat comes from either a creature or plant initially. While we don't eat as much wildlife as we used to because the food inventory network has become so modern, yields in animals were wildlife at a certain point. Many individuals rely upon wildlife for their food, too. Without an assortment of food sources, our nourishment endures. Ensuring wildlife and regular environments and food security all over the planet. We can likewise further develop nourishment by getting back to all the more wild food sources and enhancing our weight control plans. A lot of medication comes from wildlife. People have consistently gone to nature for medication. Numerous clinical frameworks, like Chinese customary medication, depend on spices, flavors, and then some. However, even drugs wouldn't be the place where they are today without wildlife. Medications like morphine, penicillin, and ibuprofen were obtained from wild plants. Securing wildlife and their natural surroundings means fewer illnesses that influence people. The safeguarding of wildlife and where they reside is significant for human well-being. Research shows that in assorted, insured, and normal regions, there are fewer examples of jungle fever and Lyme infection. 60% of irresistible illnesses, counting COVID-19, come from animals. Closeness to animals builds the dangers for infections evolving and a jumping species. By ensuring territories, people, and wildlife don't need to live so near one another. Individuals rely upon wildlife for their vocations. For some individuals, wildlife is their fundamental kind of revenue. As per the World Economic Forum, $44 trillion, the greater part of the world's GDP, is attached to nature. In the global south, 1.6 billion individuals rely upon timberlands. All around the world, 3/4 occupations rely upon water. As wildlife and their living spaces recoil, positions are lost. Wildlife has social importance. The effect wildlife has on culture can't be disregarded. The presence of animals and plants has consistently impacted things like strict convictions and food. In numerous native gatherings, sage is an indispensable spice for strict functions. For adherents of Hinduism, elephants and cows are hallowed images. Local dishes made with nearby fixings protect memory and custom while likewise uniting networks. To keep culture and customs alive, it's essential to ensure wildlife. Wildlife is significant for the economy. Wildlife preservation regions and safeguarded regular living spaces draw in guests from everywhere in the world. Many spots rely upon wildlife for the travel industry, which makes up more than 10% of the world's GDP. Nations like Brazil, Australia, Kenya, and more are particularly subject to the travel industry. Without wildlife, the economy of numerous nations would endure essentially. Securing wildlife creates more positions. Talking about the economy, wildlife protection likewise creates more positions. For instance, a major preservation and reasonable administration project in Honduras made north of 8,000 positions and raised local area pay levels by more than 300%. As indicated by research from Heidi Peltier, an exploration teacher and master in work in the U.S. economy, protection and park improvement make a larger number of positions than oil and gas altogether. The formation of agrina positions prompts a more feasible and useful economy. Being around wildlife and nature is great for emotional wellness. There's a worldwide psychological wellness emergency. Proof shows that nature can help. Individuals who live near indigenous habitats and wildlife are viewed as more dynamic, genuinely amazing, and better. In one task in the UK, volunteers with poor emotional wellness went to a park and nature strolls and protection work. Following 12 weeks, they revealed feeling much improved. To ensure our emotional wellness, we want to secure wildlife and the environments they live in. What are the benefits of wildlife? Wildlife gives many advantages to nature and human beings as well. They give food, shelter, wood, and many other resources for human life. They also help in reducing global warming by managing greenhouse gas. What is the largest forest in the world? The Amazon is undoubtedly one of the largest forests and wildlife in the world. It is not only one of the biggest forests, but also home to various species that are currently living on our Earth. Where is Amazon forest? The Amazon forest is the largest and spreads across 8 developing countries, including Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, and Suriname. Is also a domestic asset that not only helps to maintain the ecological balance, but also benefits from financial, recreational, and aesthetic points of perspective. There was a time when the number of wild animals was quite large when human interference was minimum and there was no issue with their safety or conservation. But, with the development of farming, settlement, industrial and other development activities, and primarily due to man's greed, the number of wild animals gradually decreased and decreased. As a consequence, several animal species have become extinct and several are on the brink of being so. The Wildlife Conservation Essay is an insight into the requirements of conserving wildlife globally. While the world's nations must be very specific in terms of wildlife conservation, the amount of wildlife is diminishing day by day. The World Wildlife Fund is a global organization that does a praiseworthy job of encouraging wildlife protection. National agencies are also involved in wildlife conservation. Wildlife tourism is basically the viewing of wild animals in their natural habitats. Tourism affects the ecosystem of wildlife both positively and negatively. Tourism can lead to interference and destruction of the wildlife ecosystem, leading to decrease in the population of the animals and degradation of their habitats. Tourists will interfere with the welfare of the wild animals through their interactions with the animals. The roads and paths that offer access to the wild animals also lead to destruction of the natural habitat of the wild animals. Tourism can also have numerous positive effects on wildlife. Due to the huge incomes that tourism generates, authorities and local communities will aim at preserving the natural habitat of the animals for continued gains in the future. Part of the money earned from tourism can be used for conservation of endangered species and safeguarding the habitat of the wild animals through fencing. Tourism is known to finance conservation efforts of wildlife. Opponents of the argument that tourism negatively affects wildlife claim that tourism in fact promotes conservation efforts of wildlife and their habitat through provision of financial aid. They argue that part of the revenue obtained from tourism is channeled back to conservation efforts of the wildlife, like conservation of endangered species. They also argue that local communities and authorities are dedicated to conserving wildlife primarily because of tourism, as most of them earn their living through tourism-related activities. Rebuttal to the argument that tourism finances conservation effort of wildlife and their habitats. Tourism leads to destruction and interference of the wildlife's habitat. In places with wildlife that attracts tourists, part of the wildlife's habitat is cleared in order to pave way for construction of amenities that meet the needs of tourists, like resorts. Green and Higginbottom, 2001, page 37. Tourists may engage in off-road driving and walking through wildlife habitat, which leads to trampling of vegetation and death of small living creatures. Tourism leads to disturbance of normal activities of wildlife. Tourism disrupts the feeding and breeding patterns of wildlife. Tourists move too close to animals with the aim of viewing and taking photographs. The animals become aware of the presence of humans and cannot continue with their routine activities. A study in Mexico revealed a decrease in breeding of brown pelicans by 52 to 100% in areas frequented by tourists compared to areas not visited by tourists. Tourists disrupt the bonding between parent and offspring. In Canada, female harp seals' attendance to their pups reduced when tourists were present. Tourism activities create awareness on conservation efforts of endangered species. Opponents of the argument that tourism negatively affects wildlife claim that tourism creates awareness on conservation of endangered species. Some tourists engage in studying of the ecosystem and create awareness to raise funds for various projects aimed at conservation of the ecosystem. Rebuttal to the argument that tourism creates awareness on conservation efforts of endangered species. Tourism activities may lead to increased vulnerability of some species to predators. Viewing of certain species of wildlife may expose them to predators, leading to a decrease in their population. Certain tourism activities may scare away wildlife from their habitat. In Kenya, increased observation of cheetahs drives them away from their habitat into community farms. Tourism increases cases of poaching and game hunting. Poachers masquerading as tourists gain access to wildlife that have body parts with high monetary value, like elephant tusks. Controlling poaching becomes difficult and expensive. Green and Higginbottom, 2001, page 23. Tourists also contribute to decreased population of wildlife through activities like game hunting and sport fishing. The effects can be severe without proper regulation of these activities. The growing practice of ecotourism offers great benefits to wildlife. Opponents of the argument that tourism negatively affects wildlife claim that with the increase in the practice of ecotourism, greater care is taken to educate tourists of the need for preserving wildlife and their habitat. Rebuttal of the argument that ecotourism offers benefits to wildlife. Tourism activities like noise and feeding of wildlife affects behavior and welfare of wildlife. In the Galapagos Islands, artificial feeding led to disruption of breeding patterns of iguanas. Noise generated by motor boats and engines of motor vehicles as tourists move closer to the animals tend to disturb feeding and drinking patterns of wildlife. Newsom and Moore 2005, page 75. Tourism leads to decreased pollution of the wildlife habitat. Tourists lead to pollution of the habitat through littering and noise pollution, which tend to scare wild animals. The use of vehicles and motorboats leads to further pollution of the environment. Burning firewood for providing warmth in resorts leads to environmental pollution. Wildlife tourism is a major source of revenue for countries in Africa and South American countries. However, without proper coordination, it can negatively impact on the wildlife and their habitat. For sustainable tourism, structures should be put in place to minimize the negative effects of tourism to wildlife. Efforts to educate tourists on conserving wildlife should be practiced. Nothing in the world exists in a vacuum, and the ability to find links between different things defines the degree of our maturity. People often forget that the planet is not their property, and it makes them utilize harmful and unethical approaches to wild animals and their rights. In 2015, Kate Clark presented a series of taxidermy sculptures with human faces to illustrate people's unwillingness to recognize themselves as a part of nature. The combination of the brilliant idea and extremely controversial art materials raises a lot of concerns. At the same time, the existence of such projects highlights the need to answer the following question: where do we stand concerning wildlife? If there is one more approach apart from the normalization of violence against animals and supporting hypocritical animal protection initiatives, people have to find it. In modern works devoted to wild nature and its meaning for the human race, some authors tend to criticize the approach to understanding wildlife based on the romanticization of nature as an object. For instance, in her work titled A Shark in the Mind of One Contemplating Wilderness, Tempest Williams argues that wild nature is unique in its beauty when it is in motion. The author is a professional naturalist and environmental activist, and her love for nature prevents her from seeing animals as things that can be studied in any possible ways. Although the preservation of animal remains with the help of taxidermy belongs to the techniques that are commonly used in science, the author claims that there are many hidden threats and ethical issues associated with it. The use of animal bodies can lead to further progression of scientific knowledge in biology and increase common people's levels of zoological literacy. However, apart from its scientific purposes, taxidermy can sometimes be seen as a form of art, and this tendency bothers modern environmental activists. As for the essay by Tempest Williams, one of the author's main arguments relates to people's inability to understand the beauty and complexity of wilderness by staring at dead bodies surrounded by decorations aimed at representing forests, meadows, snow-covered regions, or other places of habitation. In her work, Tempest Williams criticizes her opponent's points by comparing and contrasting her experiences related to wild nature in motion and its said immortal form. The existing links between wilderness, violence, and the transformation of art seem to be used to justify the unnecessary exploitation of natural resources, including animals. After getting acquainted with the projects of Damien Hirst, a contemporary artist from the UK who uses the bodies of animals to challenge common statements about mortality, Tempest Williams gets at the heart of the problem with the understandings of wilderness.